Hi, friends. So today I want to talk about care, which is something we seem to keep coming back to over the course of the last week. I think my main idea here is just to kind of talk about how care is something that is constructed and it's something that's complicated. I don't think I have a more complete idea here than that. What I really have is a sort of scholarly-ish observation and then a few vignettes, if you will, drawn from my own experience that got me thinking about care. First, the sort of scholarly point about the constructedness of care. I think sometimes we overlook that care is something we have to build, and we have to build in this really painstaking way. It's not something that just arises in the absence of other forces. To kind of circle back to that like suspicious or resistant reading tradition that both Matt and Robin invoke, I think sometimes we as humanists act as if we can use that method to sort of tear down all of these structures that cause people not to care about their fellow human beings. And if we do that, we'll be left with a sort of like default species being, right? It's kind of like Rousseauian self by way of Rogers and Hammerstein. Like if hatred has to be carefully taught, then if we undo that teaching and set the self free, that self will care about other selves, right? Just tear down the structures that divide us and reveal the underlying wholeness of humanity. Which is a beautiful idea, right? But sadly, I think it steers us pretty wrong. There's been a bunch of recent research that touches on that. Dana Boyd has written about how media literacy training, which wants to in part teach people to be suspicious of media narratives so they aren't swayed by the ways those narratives might be complicit in racism or sexism or other forms of oppression, can actually have the opposite effect, right? If we make people suspicious of media messages, she tells us what they actually do is fall back, right, on more deeply held forms of implicit bias to try to decide what's true. I even saw some tweets the other day from a public opinion researcher who was seeing this happen in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine. This researcher claimed, right, they claimed that higher distrust in media in Russia, right, correlated with higher levels of support for the war in Ukraine, right, which is remarkable, right, because all of the media in Russia right now at this point, the independent media has been closed down. All of the remaining media is pro-war propaganda. But if you distrust those media messages, this researcher says, what you say is, well, I don't know what's true. Everybody's lying. Everybody's saying things that are untrue. And you fall back on your sense of national identity. And when you do that, if you're Russian, you want to support your side in the war, right? And you want to support your people, as it were. So I think, these forms of bias and identity are, of course, themselves constructs. If we could somehow tear the narrative down enough, right? Maybe we could tear them all the way down, right? Maybe we could get rid of even those, tear those out. I mean, maybe. But historically, right, attempts to do that have really struggled, I think, just because the discursive roots of those structures are very broad and they're very deep. So instead of thinking about just tearing things down, and this is something I think I'm hearing Matt and Robin say as well, right? Instead of just thinking about tearing things down, maybe we have to think about building things up, right? What is this more caring person we want to build, right? What does this thing care that we want to encourage look like? And I think that might be more complex than we might initially guess, or at least than I initially guessed. Like I admit the possibility that I'm just stupid about this. But here are three sort of vignettes about care that raise problems or maybe complexities about care, who we care for, how we care for them, and what care means. Vignette 1, Star Trek. So there's this moment in Star Trek: The Next Generation where some unnamed crew member of the Starship Enterprise dies. Like, not someone we as an audience have met, just somebody who's on the ship somewhere. And they're having a wake for them in one episode. And Commander Data comes up to Commander Riker and asks him, right, in that way that he's always asking things as the moral android, like, why do people keep asking me if I knew this person who died well? Like, why do they keep asking me if I was close to them? And, Riker kind of replies to Data and says, well, people feel more strongly when someone they know well, a close friend or a loved one, dies than when a stranger dies. And Data replies to him, well, wouldn't it be better if people felt every death the same? And Riker kind of smiles that wan Jonathan Frakes smile that I always wanted to emulate when I was 14 and never quite could, and says, I suppose it would be, Data. I suppose it would be. Yeah, but what he should have said was, no, Data, that's a moral and ethical and emotional impossibility, right? Like, people can't feel every death like it was a loved one's death. Human existence would collapse into an apocalypse of pain and grief if they did. I looked this up. Just in the United States, every day, 10 children between the ages of 1 and 4 die, right? Just in the United States, can you imagine living every day feeling the deaths of those 10 kids the way their parents feel those deaths, right? No one could go on. So we want care to be boundless. We want it to encompass everyone in the same way, but we probably can't do that. Not while remaining anything like human, right? Care is going to be bounded somehow, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. Speaking of kids, Vignette 2. The beach. So this summer, I brought my 2-year-old son down to the ocean for the first time. And we're there the first night. And even though it's getting dark, and even though he's still wearing all his clothes, what my son wants to do is just leap out of my arms and into the waves, right? And he's like that the whole trip, like just wanted to run into the ocean. No regard for the fact that the ocean was very, very big and he is very, very small and that wouldn't be safe in any way. He gets his bravery from his mother and his interest in the ocean from me. Anyway, I'm standing there that first night with him in my arms, and he's trying to jump into the ocean, and all I can think about is how someday, right, I won't always be able to hold him safe like that. Like, I will have to let him take risks that I don't want him to take, right? Like, as a parent, like, that is something I am going to have to come to terms with. I mean, even on that trip, I eventually had to let him run further down the beach than I really felt comfortable doing. And so, while he's a little kid, of course, my role as a caregiver is to protect him and to nurture him. But someday he's going to be older and he's going to want to go surfing or ride a motorcycle or do some other risky thing. And to be caring, right, I'm going to have to balance my want to protect him against his want to be his own person. I'm going to somehow have to negotiate that. And he and I are going to have to somehow negotiate that between us, right? There's going to have to be some kind of negotiation there, some kind of balancing of that. And for me, what that really highlights is how care has to be negotiated and how difficult that is, right? How what we want for others isn't always what they want for themselves. Vignette 3, Animal Farm. So another thing I did this summer was I participated in the raising of animals for food, including the process of slaughtering them. We did chickens of our own, and I helped a neighbor with some pigs. I'll spare you the details of that. But in ethical terms, what this means for me is I've had to make sense somehow of the idea of living with a concept of care that includes caring for and nurturing an animal, but also killing it, right? Like, I think as modern people who buy food at the store, it's easy to maintain a kind of bright line between animals like our pets that we have feelings for and animals that we eat. But when you raise an animal for food, that line goes away, right? You care about your livestock, you nurture them, you feel warmly about them, and then you kill them as gently as you can and you eat them. And the thing is, that sort of blurry line where caring for an animal and killing it are not mutually exclusive is strange for me, but I think not very strange for most of humanity. Historically, we lived much closer to our food, and I don't say that to valorize this position, but just to point out the historical strangeness of what we think of as normal, right? And I also think that desire to maintain this bright line between care and death may sometimes encourage us to abdicate our responsibility, right, for things in ways that hinder our ability to care in a larger way. So, I don't have a neat bow to tie around these three little stories. They're just moments that leapt to mind for me when I started to think about care as it was invoked by all of you. I'll be really curious to see what sorts of questions or responses they elicit from all of you in the next week. I hope you all take care of yourselves this week, and I hope you do well. As I tell my students, take care, everybody, and I will see you next week.